the mastery, I think, of history is to tell the story. Ever since, we were cavemen, we've always wanted to know what happened next, when they're listening to stories in the caves. And nothing has changed. You want to know what happens next. And if you can harness that natural curiosity and always be objective, always tell the truth, and try and be interesting. Don't go down these rabbit holes that I know you're in academia, but I know this doesn't happen at Hillsdale, but boy does it in lots of other universities in both your country and mine. They become so specialised into such tiny little areas that you can't essentially see the woods for the trees. I think if you put all of that together, then people have a huge thirst for history and for knowing more about the past. And that's what gets me out of bed in the mornings.
Lord Roberts, how are you?
On top form, Larry. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. I will tell the audience that this man has a range unlike anybody else. He's written 19 or 20 books. He's published all over the place. He's conservative and a distinguished academic, and that makes, with few people I know here at Hillsdale College, about 10 of us. And he's a member of the House of Lords and recent peerage. I'm going to ask him about that. But we're going to talk about history and contemporary world and Britain and America and everything, because we can talk about anything with the man. And this is going to go about an hour, and it won't be long enough. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, Larry. It's great to be on your show.
You've written the best biography of Winston Churchill, leaving out of account my teacher, Martin Gilbert, which I won't make a comparison with, but yours is very lively and has the great advantage of being true.
Well, that coming from seriously, one of the great world experts on Winston Churchill, that means a lot to me. So I appreciate that very much indeed, Larry.
Yeah, well, you're the only man I know. I met Andrew Roberts, I'll bet it's 30 years ago.
Maybe. I think I was about to say 30. Yeah, that's what my
in London,
guesstimate was going to be.
And we were both younger then. He's younger than I am. And I remember he gave a talk. Maybe it was one of the clubs on Pall Mall. And I'd never heard of him. One of my staff guys found him. And he gave this talk, and I went, wow, that guy's good. And I never think that about historians. So,
okay, I'm going to not take that personally somehow.
You shouldn't. Yeah. You've written books about a range of things that are interesting. You've written about Churchill, and you've written about Lord Halifax, often a political adversary of Churchill. You've written about Hitler, consistently a political adversary of Churchill. You've written about Napoleon. You've written a book called Eminent Churchillians. My wife and I were laughing because I read a paragraph to her years ago from it. And she said, wow, is this the Daily Mail in a book?
Again, I'm going to take that as a compliment, however it was meant.
It is a compliment. So I want to talk about. I want to isolate two things. Three things. What is Britain? What do you learn about it from studying the British statesman and the German that you've studied? And what's at stake today? And what do you think about politics in the world today? So we'll talk about those three things.
Gosh, they're big ones, aren't they?
They are.
What is Britain? What is Britain? Okay, well, I'll take that from a sort of intellectual point of view, I think. I think we are your wingman. I think when we're behaving at our best, we are beside you in the great struggles of the globe today. When we act below ourselves, when we put our own interests before the greater good of freedom and liberty and the world, we can seem a bit pathetic. And I have a sort of almost Gaullist sense of Britain in the way that de Gaulle felt that when France was not behaving nobly, then it was falling below the level of events. I feel the same way about my country. And I fear that in the next few years we might fall below the level of events. We do stupid things that are not worthy of Britain. We did one yesterday. Classic example. The Labour Party sending 100 of its people off to America to campaign for one of your candidates for the presidency. Frankly, in my view, it didn't matter which one it was, because it's absolutely wrong to do that. You can't do that, because if the other candidate wins, you're jeopardising the special relationship. It was a pathetic and stupid thing to do, and those are the moments when I feel ashamed of my country. But overall, when one looks at the way that yours and mine have worked together since the Second World War, I feel very proud of my country. So so that's my view on who we are. What was the next question? Sorry, the second one.
I want to go into that one a little more. So first of all, we too have tremendous capacity to fall below the level of events these days. And we're maybe about to sort that out in one direction or another pretty soon here in America. But you are our wingman, and we are your child. Isn't that odd? And that word special relationship, that's in that great speech by Churchill in 1946. What did he say was the ground of that relationship?
Well, I think, 46, obviously, that great speech is so important, the Iron Curtain speech, but let's go back to the Harvard speech of September 43, where he talked about law, liberty and language. And he obviously had that fantastic sense for language. But law, liberty, and language, they're pretty great things to have in common, aren't they?
They are.
And so I think those are the founding blocks. I think it's interesting that the phrase freedom of speech is not found in any other country until it has already been used in English in the 17th century for 100 years.
Yeah.
It says something, doesn't it? That?
It does, yeah. Yeah, I see if you agree with this. What Churchill thought Britain was unique in a way that America is in its own way also unique. That is to say, it's this little island, happens to be located near all the big stuff in the world. And because it's an island, it developed representative institutions. Power could be assembled to keep the peace at home and abroad, but also it was diversified, and it started from the bottom up. Churchill believed that. And then it spread all over the world. Churchill thought it was important about the British Empire that it was not, by and large, an act of conquest, which says something about the nature of the country that got all those possessions. So that, in other words, it's the nature of Britain that it's like that.
And the other thing, of course, about being insular is that you're not invaded, or at least we haven't been successfully invaded since 1066. And so over those 900 years, you can develop a foreign policy. In our case, obviously, the one of trying to stop anyone gaining hegemony in Europe. Because if they do, then they're a threat. They're an invasion threat to you. So at the Spanish Armada, or the Wars of Spanish Succession, or Napoleon, or the Kaiser, obviously Hitler as well. These are moments when Britain, the island, sends forth its people to try, always in coalition, to stop the major power, be it Germany, be it France, be it Spain, you name it, from gaining hegemony. I think that's another very important aspect of our insular nation.
Yeah, and there it suggests this special relationship. We're different countries. I'm married to a woman from yours, and that's that's a very special relationship. And
except she says that I write like the Daily Mail.
she actually she doesn't like me to mention it, but she does like the Daily Mail.
Okay, now you can give Penny my love.
It's people don't know what that means, but it's gossipy. I have several times been written up in the Daily Mail, and I know something about her brother and her sister who live in South England. Because I know that they read it because they reacted to that.
Yeah, well, it's a conservative paper that is absolutely loathed by liberals.
Yeah, perfect.
By liberals. I've been writing for it for 35 years or so, and you never get a more irritated response from liberals than when you write something in the Daily Mail.
Yeah, I commend it to the readers. I find it entertaining. And I was written up.
I actually wrote the biography 2 years ago. I wrote the biography of the founder of the Daily Mail, Lord Northcliffe, who was an extraordinary, energetic, vital character, and a big influence. Well, as you know, obviously on the politics of Churchill and the First World War and so on.
So on this, we've just implied a foreign policy. And that foreign policy is very complicated today. And the British foreign policy, you wrote about Lord Salisbury, who used the expression "splendid isolation," and he was a sort of reluctant imperialist, as you describe him. But the strain there, and I argued that this was very dear to Winston Churchill, was that Britain would keep its independence. It would be separate and connected to the continent and everything else, but separate, that came first, right? And there's an argument, America we've always had that tendency. We're sort of in the position of Britain. 85% of the world's people live in Asia and Africa, and we're in the 15% relatively isolated North and South American continents. And so we've always had an idea, the Monroe Doctrine, which was interestingly enforced by the British Navy. Thank you very much. That we would be separate and connected. We've always believed in freedom of the seas. And in other words, everybody ought to be able to go wherever they want to go. And in the long period of British dominance, they enforced the freedom of the seas, not just for themselves. So the point is, there's a sort of a connection in foreign policy too, and we're in related situations. If you look at how big the world has become, how many people there are, how much production there is in China and growing India and all over Europe, the American share of it and the Anglo share of it is much smaller than it was 100 years ago, 50 years ago. So do we need a foreign policy today that's separate but connected?
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. No. I understand what you're getting at, where you're coming from, and the answer obviously is yes. I mean, you've got your own national interests, which of course you must follow, but also because of the world, as you say, it's huge and growing, but it's also in a sense shrinking because you can't be protected from intercontinental ballistic missiles, from the massive world trade changes, from all of the things that are that are banging at the door of every country, really, terrorism and so on. You can't entirely insulate yourself, and nor would you want to, because America is a great power and is a great force in the world, and the more of the world that America influences, in my view, the better, because you are believers in the highest notions of politics and government, and we should be learning from you. Everyone should be learning from you. But you've got a choice in this election, haven't you? Because there is a isolationist strain in one of the parties, which could be perfectly understandable in the terms of, I don't know, George Washington's farewell address, but seems pretty difficult to pull off in a world of such interconnectivity.
Yeah, I don't. And see, that's you're referring to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is neither a historian nor a political philosopher. And
Mr. Vance, his vice president, who seems more intent on isolationism than Mr. Trump.
Yeah, and I wonder, I think that story, myself, I think that story is not told. And I think there's a rationale for it that's solid. You have reacted to this attack on Churchill that this idiot Daryl Cooper made. and I say idiot, in the nicest.
You're being so kind to him. Why are you being kind to him, Larry? Just calling him an idiot. He's far worse than that, isn't he?
And he blames the Second World War on Winston Churchill. And it's just that the trouble is the facts, are a little complicated and different than he states them. Big facts or obvious facts. Anyway, but part of that is understandable, right? Because Churchill himself didn't like war. Well, he was good at it, but he was always trying to avoid it. And he thought we can't be continually at war and be a free country. And Lord help us, we've, in the name of Winston Churchill, we have undertaken to build democracy in Iraq. And Winston Churchill didn't do that. In fact, had the opportunity to do it and didn't do it. So one thing I'm saying here is that internationalism is not an iron rule, and isolationism is not an iron rule. I don't think either were a rule with Churchill. I think prudence is the rule. You want to preserve your country. You want it to prosper. You want to do the things internationally that helps it do that, and that will involve you all over the world. I don't know. How do you react to that claim?
I completely agree. No, there are no. Was it Palmerston who said there are no eternal interests?
Yeah.
Of course, you have to cut your cloth. I mean, one of the reasons that Churchill didn't found democracy in Iraq was because the whole of the sort of setting up Iraq was a cost-cutting exercise, wasn't it? For the Ministry of Defence, they were trying to see the way that they could essentially get out of Iraq with the least possible expense, and the trillions that you've spent on your wars in Iraq, our wars, should I say?
Yeah, you've spent
very
too.
much involved in both of them, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, have cost a vast amount of money. But that shouldn't necessarily, therefore, lead anybody to think that it wouldn't be in America's best interest to continue to be involved in places where you are involved. You've got lots of troops, for example, in South Korea. And have had for well over half a century. And you've kept peace in that place. And that is something I think that is very noble, but I can understand, were I an American taxpayer, that you start to wonder why.
Well, I think it's still true. It certainly was for decades. South Korea pays for that. In fact, I have a friend who was a senior diplomat, eventually vice foreign minister in South Korea. He came to my inauguration 400 years ago as president of Hillsdale College. And here's how we became friends. He bought me lunch, and I said, yeah, South Korea is the American way of doing empire. And South Koreans, you may know, are stubborn. I think they're the Irish of Asia. They say, surrounded by big powers on a peninsula. And he was, what? We're no colonial people. And I said, well, you are. I said, because what we did was went over there and fought a war and lost 50,000 soldiers doing it. And then you set up a free government, and now you're an ally and an excellent trading partner, and you pay for American troops to be there. I said, that's empire with a profit. And he said, I think we're going to be friends.
But you do give them a nuclear umbrella.
Yeah,
which
we do.
Is, I mean, obviously, if they wanted one, they're easily rich enough and advanced enough to be able to make one themselves. And one of the reasons that I slightly fear about a recrudescence of American isolationism would be that if it happens, they would have to get their own bomb. So would the Japanese. So would the Saudis. Suddenly, I think nuclear proliferation makes an awful lot of sense. You know, Ukraine wouldn't have been invaded if it had its own bomb. And the message is that if the United States pulls back and retreats towards itself, you're going to get a more dangerous world because a lot of countries are just going to nuclearize.
Yeah, these things are very difficult because, there are people who argue, and I am tempted to the view myself, that one, that's bound to happen, and two, it might not be bad. In the great Iron Curtain speech, Churchill, he wants the UN to get stronger, and then it's a very interesting reservation there. First of all, you can tell what he wants is he wants what you're calling these days, Andrew, very well, I think, the Anglosphere, to really be the driving force in the UN. And then he wants it to have an army, constables, he says, but he doesn't want it to have the big weapon. He said, no one sleeps less soundly in his bed because the United States is the ones who have that. And of course, you could think that, but for that, Stalin would have gone all the way to the Atlantic because he was certainly in a position to do it after the Second World War. So anyway, that's I have been in America. Here's what's happened about Churchill, I think, and I think this Cooper thing is a result of it. I think that we went over to Iraq. We put Churchill's bust in the Oval Office in part because of this. I like the fact that they put it there. And we went over there thinking we were doing his work in building a democracy in Iraq. And Churchill did not attempt to do that. And I think he was too knowing and wise to think that that would be... I pointed out to somebody important in the White House one time, in the middle of all this, I said, well, democracy is not something you can do for somebody else. They would have to do it. And then will they? And jury's at best out about that. And so you have that, right? First of all, we're going to go spend $2 trillion or $3 trillion, whatever it is, in Afghanistan and Iraq, building democracy. And we're going to do it in the name of Winston Churchill. And that's, conservatives who did that. And then the second step is you get other conservatives saying the whole Second World War was bad and Winston Churchill made it. And I would think that both of those propositions would not be true.
Would you call them conservatives the second lot? Aren't they ultra-rightists? I mean, Pat Buchanan, I suppose, he worked in the Nixon White House, so he was a conservative in that sense. But he's such a ultra, and obviously all that Darryl Cooper is essentially doing is channeling Pat Buchanan and, to an extent, David Irving, which Irving himself has acknowledged.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether or not you could... I'm a conservative. I really don't like the characterization of these people as conservatives as well, because I don't want to be in the same camp as them. Can I pick up something you mentioned earlier about democracy, and especially with regard to the Middle East? Because of course you're right, it is impossible. Democracy is a very, very fragile flower, frankly. Once you've got it, you have to do all sorts of things to make sure that you can keep it. But when you see, and Iraq obviously and Afghanistan, nothing like it, and now we know that they never really would be. Israel, on the other hand, is one. And yet, when that comes under a massive assault from 7 different angles, all pretty much at the same time, are your country and my country doing enough to support a genuine democracy that does exist there?
Yeah.
I wonder whether we are, because frankly, the attacks that are being made, especially in my country, where there are demonstrations every single Saturday through the streets of London against pro-Palestinian, sometimes actually pro-Hamas, with some of these people. And our universities are absolutely rife with the most terrible anti-Semitism. My real worry is that we're not doing enough to stand by something that is a genuine democracy, has been for 70 years, and is under appalling assault.
Yeah, I agree with that. The way I think about these things is, let's go back. Who are going to be your friends, right? Do you need friends? The first question is, do you need friends? Looks to me like the answer to that question is obviously yes. And then the second is, who's going to be your friends? Well, you said what was to Churchill and to me, and I think the key thing about the British, we can talk together, ordinary people, right? And but the politics comes from talking. And so and then they have you have these mother of parliaments. You are a member of it. And so, yeah, Britain's a friend, and we should pray, I do, that they will recover themselves and find somebody better to be the prime minister of that country. But, who am I to say? Israel needs to be on the list. Israel is on the sea. If you want to live in the Middle East, whatever your nationality or race, and you want to write what you want in the newspaper and vote in free and unfettered elections, it is better to live in Israel because they have that, right? And they give that to the Arabs who live in Israel too. And they have a political party. They have more than one in Israel, and they share in power. And so, yeah, and then, they are very good fighters, are they not? And they seem to be efficient still in fighting, because I think the American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan did marvelously. I think they fought better than people have tended to fight in those places. I'm not sure they were fighting to the correct end, but they did great. I think Israel is in the tunnels in Gaza. Their casualties are very low, and they are scientific about it. They preserve life as much as they can, and they preserve Arab lives as much as they can. So, yeah, I think that's a friend. I think in America, the defense industry needs more competition, and I think we should look for some of it in Israel. Because they make but the trouble is what we're doing in this country is actually refusing to sell certain arms to Israel. We've actually got a government boycott of certain arms that we will not sell to Israel. That we are on the wrong side of this in so many ways. Oh, yeah.
It's an appalling thing to have done. And actually, with your President Biden, who from the moment after the initial sort of hugging of Bibi Netanyahu, after that, it's just been endless finger wagging. Don't do this, don't do the other. Don't go into Rafah was one of the major things. If Bibi had done what Biden said, Sinwar would still be alive today.
Yeah.
It's a bad thing when the president of a country like America actually gives advice that very clearly, or sort of semi-orders, that very clearly, when it's ignored, it turns out to be the right thing.
Yeah, that's something. Yeah. I mean, Hamas, that's a terrorist group, right? Named so by the United States. And they have governed Gaza into a fortress and an assault point against Israel. And now we want to, and then they go kill a bunch of people in a most gruesome way, including babies. And we want to regulate how Israel fights that. And Churchill had, there are two quotes from Lincoln and Churchill that I used to keep on my wall. I think I might put them back. Lincoln talked about the cost of the Civil War, and he said, "You don't fight wars by blowing rose water through elder stalk squirts."
I've never heard that quote before. That's a fabulous quote.
It's pretty good. And
you might have to send that to me afterwards, Larry, because that's a great one.
And I used to keep these two pictures in my office in Claremont before I came to Hillsdale, a long time ago now. And Churchill's, one of my favorite quotes from him is at the Canadian Parliament, "We have not traveled all this way across the oceans, across the mountains, across the prairies, because we are made of sugar candy."
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. But the trouble is that with the military spending in both my country and yours dropping so considerably over the past few years, admittedly more in my country than yours, we're down to 2.3% of GDP. At least you're a bit over 3%. Can we actually sort of affect the world if things go badly wrong in a world that is becoming more dangerous as the axis of ill will gets tighter and more aggressive? Are we even going to be able to defend
or more starkly,
our values?
Are we going to be able to defend ourselves? I mean, that's, in the end, that's the point, right? You start with that. There's a passage. I meant to look it up and I didn't get time today, but in 1929, when there's a lot of Churchill's just out of power, and there's a lot of talk about Germany rearming, Hitler's not in power yet, and there's a letter in which Churchill expresses some reluctance to get involved with France. He said, "We should think about this first, because our first job is to protect ourselves." Well, forgetting for a moment that my wife is a British subject, I, as an American citizen, I think our first job is to protect ourselves, and the special relationship is handy to that, important to that, right? And that's why I'm in favor of it. And that's why the greatest British statesman, including Winston Churchill, who was not, in my argument, simply an internationalist, he was a prudent man. And that means the doctrine doesn't tell you what to do in all cases. So that's
absolutely right. I mean, it's back to Palmerston, and of course, my political heroine, as well as Winston Churchill, my heroine is Margaret Thatcher, and I grew very much under Margaret Thatcher. Grew up under her, and because she later became a friend, she used to come around here for dinner and so on, and that was very much her stance as well. Look, the American alliance isn't there out of nostalgia; it's there because both countries do better as a result of it existing, and the world is a better place for it existing. And that was her argument, and I really, truly believe it.
Wasn't she wonderful? I didn't know her as well as you, but I knew her pretty well. Met her through Martin Gilbert in the beginning. But I did once, and I knew Ronald Reagan, and I twice carried messages between them.
Fantastic.
And both times, because I actually told Ronald Reagan, I said, you're the greatest man I ever met, but I confess, you've always seemed a little soft to me. And he said, soft? And I said, yeah. I said, I was living in England when Margaret Thatcher came to power. And then I moved back in August of 1980. And then you were elected. And I watched the two of you start. And he said, well, that's not really fair. Who's as tough as she? Well, I told her that story. And she scolded the daylights out of me.
I think you deserved it on both counts, frankly, Larry.
You must not talk to Ronnie that way. Anyway, she was I'm like you. I long for those politics again. And I think we may get them again. Now, I want to talk about, because you're a great historian, and
thank you.
I want to talk about that. How do you, first of all, there's, you have a gift. The only rival I know is in these times, in my lifetime, is Martin Gilbert. As to say, there's an endless amount of stuff to know. And how do you get it right? Tell me how you go about it.
Well, actually, in a way, I was taught this because Martin used to talk about it all the time, and he's so right. Chronology. Chronology is all. The narrative is central. Never tell the reader what he or she doesn't need to know at the time of the book. Always remember that people only know what has already happened, that you can't see 10 minutes ahead. If you could, I'd be putting money on the 320 at Uttoxeter races right now. And so don't make the mistake of thinking that anybody in the past could look into the future in the way that we can look into their pasts. And so the mastery, I think, of history is to tell the story. Ever since, we were cavemen, we've always wanted to know what happened next, when they're listening to stories in the caves. And nothing has changed. You want to know what happens next. And if you can harness that natural curiosity and always be objective, always tell the truth, and try and be interesting. Don't go down these rabbit holes that I know you're in academia, but I know this doesn't happen at Hillsdale, but boy does it in lots of other universities in both your country and mine. They become so specialised into such tiny little areas that you can't essentially see the woods for the trees. I think if you put all of that together, then people have a huge thirst for history and for knowing more about the past. And that's what gets me out of bed in the mornings.
It changes things, because one of the marvels, if you know a little British history, is that you've written sympathetically about Lord Halifax, who was, along with Neville Chamberlain, the leader and Baldwin before him of the appeasers, and the people who thwarted Churchill's hopes for rearmament for a time in Britain, which he thought would have prevented the Second World War. And you've written about him, and maybe that's the key to it. What did he know on the day, and according to what principle did he act? And if you just let that unfold, then the story tells itself. Is that why you have some sympathy to him, right?
I do, but the thing that made me come round to him was the way in which, after Munich, he essentially broke from Chamberlain and recognised that Hitler was all the things that Churchill had said that he was. And so by the time of the occupation of Prague and Bohemia in the March of 1939, he was putting pressure on Chamberlain to give the guarantee to Poland, the essential tripwire that starts the Second World War. So I saw in Halifax somebody who, through a logical, reasonable assessment of the facts, came round to Churchill's position from having been completely antithetical to it.
There you go. I have edited the last document volumes of the Churchill biography.
I know it is one of the great monuments of modern scholarship, Larry. It's something we're always going to thank you for forever.
Well, all I did was do the end of it, but I was determined about that. And but Halifax is important because he's the ambassador in Washington, and I learned about him by reading all those documents. And he was, and he kept a diary, which Churchill did not do. He just published everything. But he really did come to a great admiration of Winston Churchill. And that's to his credit, in my opinion. So that's the thing. Now, Hitler, you've written a book comparing Churchill and Hitler as they spoke. What was good about Hitler, his speaking style?
Well, he had a series of tricks that he played, essentially, which Churchill didn't do. Churchill, as we know, practiced a great deal and didn't think of himself as an instinctual speaker, but worked hard at it. What Hitler did instead was to employ various tricks. He would wait standing in front of the audience for anything up to as long as a minute before he started speaking, to build up the sort of expectation. He would start speaking very slowly and he would speed up during the course of the 40-minute or so addresses that he would give, usually half-an-hour addresses. He would start very quietly and then build up in volume. And so people wouldn't notice these things until, of course, he's ranting at the end of the speech. The other thing was his sentences got shorter and shorter. Churchill would employ, as you know, subclauses and so on, and various other. He'd speak in paragraphs and he'd be logical. Hitler wouldn't. He recognised that actually you could just suddenly yell one people, one Reich, one Führer, and that would sort of be a excuse for for logical thought. And when in a speech nowadays we only ever see those the last 3 minutes or so of his speeches when he's yelling and shouting, and we think, how on earth can people have put up with half an hour of being yelled at and shouted at? It wasn't like that. He slowly built up, like the frog being sort of boiled. He slowly built up to the point that his audience didn't realise what was going on until they themselves also were in a frenzy.
Churchill, in his novel and in his essay, Scaffolding of Rhetoric, these are all very young things in his life.
Yeah, well, the Scaffolding of Rhetoric, he writes about how to give a public speech before he had even given one. It's a classic example of him using of him having a theory and then following through the theory in his life. It's just extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah,
that essay.
And Weldon, who was the head of Harrow School, was a great 19th century translator of Aristotle, especially of Aristotle's Rhetoric. And I don't know whether Churchill learned the elements that are in that boy essay, Scaffolding of Rhetoric, from Weldon or not, but they are very like Aristotle's book, Rhetoric, and it's tremendous. But see, I think that there's a distinction that's obvious between Churchill and Hitler in the purpose of their speaking. And Churchill makes that explicit in this novel, Savrola, where there's a chapter where he takes that essay, Scaffolding Rhetoric, and he sort of puts it to fiction. Anyway, the point is that there shouldn't be violence provoked by a speech. There should be a release in the speech for the people so that they behave moderately and better instructed. Whereas Hitler looks to me like he's provoking. I mean, he did, in fact, provoke to violence. But I think that was his point, too. I think he wanted to turn the people into an army and set them marching in his cause. And
well, he was a revolutionary, of course, so violence was an absolutely essential part of what he was trying to pull off, whereas Churchill was a conservative and later a liberal and the absolute opposite of revolutionary. And, of course, when the real revolutionaries come, the Bolsheviks first and then the Nazis, Churchill is the most early and the most eloquent and the hardest hitting of all the voices against them. I think it's very interesting what you said about Aristotle because, of course, he writes Scaffolding of Rhetoric when he's in his very early 20s, and he starts reading the great philosophers when he's in the Northwest Frontier in his mid to late 20s, isn't he? So I think he must have written Scaffolding of Rhetoric before reading Aristotle. So I suspect it might well be Weldon that he got those ideas from.
Yeah,
very
I wonder. There's a correspondence between this guy, J.E.C. Weldon, was a headmaster of Harrow School. He was later a Christian missionary in India. And he corresponds with Churchill in
He
that
becomes
period.
a bishop, I think, at some stage, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's he's an interesting guy, and I don't know. I should know, but I don't know what Churchill learned from him. But the other thing about Churchill is people always say to me, "How did you do this? How did you do that?" And I always say, it's not quite fair. He was a very remarkable man. He just learned a lot of stuff, and he just could do things. And he writes in the Marlborough, in his biography of the Duke of Marlborough,
which you can see, by the way, just there.
There it is.
I've got it. There it is, and there we go. And it's it's the first edition, signed first edition. I'm very excited by that, as you can imagine.
Have you had that long?
Sorry?
Have you had that very long?
Yes. No, absolutely. As soon as I could afford it.
As soon as you can afford it, yeah. That's expensive.
Yeah.
So I have a trustee of the college who lately asked me, are there any first editions of Churchill's books that you do not own? And I couldn't answer that question. And so I went and looked, and I discovered that I own none of them. And I'll tell you the reason for it. One of my teachers said to me when I was a graduate student, there are people who can afford to own books, and there are people who can afford to read books, and you have to decide which you're going to be.
Well, can you tell him from me that is not true?
Not true. Yeah, I could afford to own. I may get some now. I don't know, but I have all of the books, and I tend to have the ones that are the best editions, right? And sometimes they come later because he made changes, and so anyway, never mind that. But
no.
If I want to talk about two curiosities to me. You're writing about them. And then I want to talk about Andrew Roberts, the statesman. The curiosities are George III and Napoleon, both of whom you are defenders. And I guess Churchill fancied Napoleon.
Yeah, he did. He said he was the greatest man of action since Julius Caesar.
Yeah, he did. But he wasn't like Napoleon, Churchill. I mean, can you imagine that?
Well, no, he was a Democrat, wasn't he, Churchill? Whereas Napoleon he overthrew the French government in a military coup and ruled as dictator. So I think that's fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and Napoleon was an extremely aggressive conqueror of other countries, and Churchill was never that. Was he? I see. I don't go along with that. There were 7 wars of the coalitions that eventually brought down Napoleon, and he was responsible for 2 of them: the invasion of Spain and the invasion of Russia. The other 5 were started by the legitimist powers, the anti-French powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, and others, who couldn't bear the idea of there being a Corsican nobody as emperor. They didn't like his policy of meritocracy and other sort of forward-thinking progressivist ideas that threatened their own thrones. So actually, they declared more war against Napoleon than Napoleon ever declared against them. That's pretty good. Yeah, see, I knew you'd have something great to say about that. And see, one of my favorite sayings when we're making plans around Hillsdale College, one of my favorite things to say is, you're probably not a good way to embark on a war by attacking Moscow in the winter. That's what I say when somebody's got some whacking big expensive plan.
Well, actually, General Montgomery made much the same remark when he was in the House of Lords, and he said there are 2 rules of warfare. The first one is never invade Russia, and the second one is never trust the RAF with your luggage.
A prudent man. Now, George III Of course, over here, when you told me you were writing this book, you may remember what I said. I said, "Wow, that's bold." And
yeah, I think you also told me I wasn't going to sell any copies, and you were right about that. That's not true. I've sold about 60,000, but not as many as I was hoping for.
You sell a lot of books, but 60,000 is a big number. But also The Last King of America, that was clever, but.
It's true, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is true. It's true. Yeah. And, it is, you have a gift for this, by the way. It's one of those obvious truths that everyone misses.
Thanks, old boy. I appreciate
It's
that.
very good. Make a defense of him. What is the thing? He's the British tyrant that we threw off. What about
the first defence is that he in no way was a tyrant.
Yeah.
That's the first defence, which you'll appreciate when you read the book. That America's, of course, it was right time for America to become independent in the 1770s. You had a burgeoning economy, you had a growing population. It was you had as many bookshops in Philadelphia as there were in any other city of the empire apart from London. But the idea that at 0.5% taxation you were being ground down by an evil tyrant is frankly for the birds. And when you go through the 28 clauses of the Declaration of Independence, only 2 of them hold water. The one about self-government, which, of course, you did need and have the right to, and the other one about taxation, which, again, you needed to be able to do yourself. But all the others were highly, highly exaggerated lawyers' arguments for a casus belli that Thomas Jefferson put into beautiful English, Shakespearean prose, but frankly don't hold any water intellectually at all. And you'll understand that when you read chapter 13.
That's pretty good. I've written about those passages myself. If Edmund Burke or Pitt had been in the cabinet, probably we would not be an independent country today. And I think you would be. We wouldn't be, because we'd have stayed in the same country. And your population getting larger and larger would mean that you would be getting more and more seats in the Parliament, which would have had to have moved to America, and we would be the 51st, 52nd, and 53rd state of the Union. But the positive side of things would be, of course, if the British, what became the British Empire and the American Republic were the same country, there's no way the Kaiser would have invaded Belgium. You wouldn't have got the First World War. You therefore wouldn't have got the Bolshevik Revolution, the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the world would be a much happier place. Yeah, that's good. Wouldn't have got these crazy revisionist historians either. Sorry. Can I just go ahead. Tell you about the latest thing that's happened with Churchill in Britain today? So Channel 4, which is our sort of left-wing progressivist channel, has just put out a show called Churchill: Britain's Secret Apartheid, in which they try to argue that Churchill was in favour of having segregated regiments. The United States is segregated regiments, and didn't want to do anything about it. In fact, the cabinet committee that Churchill chaired decided that black people in the American army should be allowed into all the cinemas and pubs and Lions Corner houses and everywhere, and that nothing must be done to help the American army segregate in Britain. So actually, the truth is precisely the opposite of what Channel 4 gave as the headline of its show. But because the word Churchill has to equal racist, they ran with this show, which was the precise opposite of the truth. Ooh, yeah. Isn't that extraordinary? Isn't that classic? But see, that's sometimes 180 degrees wrong indicates something about the truth.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it certainly indicates something about the people who are trying to denigrate Churchill.
I had a debate with that woman, Mukherjee, who wrote the book about Churchill starving deliberately 3 million Indians, or however many it was. And she's an incautious lady because she loves to write that Churchill always did something or that he never did something. And the particular one was express any sympathy for the starving Indians in 1943. And so I had this debate with her, and I said, here's a sentence from you. I said, so if I can find an example, you'll have to take the sentence back. And she was very uncomfortable. I had to ask her twice. And she said, yes. And I said, I have 30.
I was wondering, I was going to guess 2 dozen, but 30, that's pretty good. Well done, Larry.
They're not very careful. Now, You're a statesman. You're a member of the House of Lords, an ancient legislative body. I have watched several of your speeches in the House of Lords, and I commend them to our audience. You should look him up because he's a very interesting and eloquent man. Tell me about the House of Lords, how it works. Are they going to keep it? And what should they do?
Well, speaking as a Conservative, what they should do is keep it completely unchanged because it's a wonderful thing. Yes, we wouldn't necessarily have invented it in its precise form if we were starting off, but it's all a bit reminiscent of that old joke about the French professor in the Sorbonne who says, yes, I understand that it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And the fact is that, an appointed house with where 86% of the members are appointed by prime ministers going back to Margaret Thatcher and beyond, I think, shouldn't work, and where the other 14% are the descendants of peers going back to the 14th century, also shouldn't work. But actually it does. There's expertise there. There is a willingness, especially amongst the hereditary peers, to serve on the committees and to turn up to the debates and to contribute and to vote, obviously. And it's a incredibly good revising chamber. The House of Commons sends us its legislation. The democratically elected House, which obviously is the superior one, sends us its legislation, and we work out what will work in practice and what won't. And we have lots of ex-ministers and former civil servants, but also people from industry and from private enterprise and so on, and a few historians like me who say, well, historically this hasn't worked in the past. If you want to, and we have the right to send it back twice, but if it then comes back the third time from the Commons, then it gets turned into law. So it's a chance for the nation essentially to rethink, double check, draw breath, especially for legislation that's been passed in a knee-jerk way. And it works. But unfortunately, the Labour Party are going to reform it. I don't think for the better. They're going to chuck out all of the hereditary peers. So they're going to cut that living link with the past that we have with Britain's great past going back many centuries. They're going to enforce an age limit, which means that some of our wisest old birds who have been there for a long time, but nonetheless are still mentally extremely acute, are just going to be chucked out, even though they've got decades of experience, and they're going to have a rule where you have to turn up a certain number of times, which means that people are all going to turn up just for the minimum amount of time, and mean that the debates are going to get even shorter than they are. So I'm afraid it's a classic example of something that works extremely well being wrecked for essentially ideological reasons.
See, that's a shame. Now, Churchill was a House of Lords reformer, and in 1925, he repeated elements of a plan that he made when he was instrumental in getting it in removing the power of the House of Lords to overrule the House of Commons. He wanted to restore that ability by giving it some contact with popular election, so direct or indirect, and he wanted the peers to keep their seats. Would you like to see that happen? Something like that?
The problem with that, and as you can imagine, there are lots and lots of different plans that different people have about this. Some going back, as you say, a very long time, and others, that are still being drawn up at the moment. The problem is, if you give it an element of democratic accountability, it is going to inevitably set itself up against the House of Commons, because it's going to be able to say, we speak for the people better than you do, especially if the people are elected after the general election that elects people to the Commons. And so I wonder whether if you attempt to turn it into a second chamber which has democratic accountability, you're not going to have the same kind of log jams that you get in other chambers around the world, not least actually your own legislature, where you can have these sort of standoffs between the houses, which you don't get in the British Parliament, because ultimately the House of Commons has primacy.
Yeah, I guess I'm in favour of log jams.
Yeah, well, there is an argument for that, because you don't get any more laws, do you? And the fewer laws, the better.
Lots of laws these days. So I'm going to say this. Next month is the 250th anniversary of Winston Churchill's birth. And
no, 150th.
150th. Did I say 250th?
Yes,
oh, the 250th of the Declaration of Independence is coming up.
That's right.
A bit older than Churchill. I just want to say, Andrew, that you have carried on and explained Winston Churchill and his world better than any living man, and any man in recent memory except Martin Gilbert, who you have matched. And so I think we all owe you a debt for that. I encourage everyone who watches this to read his books. They're wonderful and fun too, and controversial sometimes.
Well, Larry, as I say, because of your knowledge of Churchill and all you've done to make his words continue to live, that really does mean an awful lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Roberts of Belgravia. I hope you keep the title.
Oh, I've got that for life. They can't take that away from me.
Can't take that away, yeah.
However old I get.
I hope you keep the seat. I hope you keep the seat. They should leave it alone. Okay. Good. Take care, Andrew. It's great.
Thanks, old boy.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.